Well, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the April 15 Race and Social Justice Colloquium, sponsored by the Shar School of Policy and Government and George Mason University. I'm Mark Roselle, Dean of the Shar School. And today, our speaker is Dr. Kimberly A. Scott, who is a professor in the School of Social Transformation and in the School for Innovation in Society at Arizona State University, and the founding executive director of Arizona State's Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. Her projects have included the National Science Foundation funded CompuGirls, the U.S. Department of Education funded CompuPower, the Pivotal funded project on Women of Color and Computing Collaborative, and the NSF funded Social Programmable Robots program for CompuGirls. Since 2018, Professor Scott has been on the NSF STEM Education Advisory Panel, created to encourage U.S. scientific and technological innovations in education, and assembled in consultation with the U.S. Department of Education, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm also happy to point out, you'll all be interested to know that Professor Scott is an affiliate faculty member in the George Mason University Center for Digital Media Innovation and Diversity. So she does know us quite well. Dr. Scott has published broadly in outlets such as the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, the International Journal of Gender Science and Technology, Feminism and Psychology, the Huffington Post, Slate, to name just several. There are many more. Professor Scott also is co-author of the book Kids in Context, published by Rowman and Littlefield, and co-editor of the volume Research in Urban Educational Settings, Lessons Learned and Implications for Future Practice. And she recently published Women Education Scholars and Their Children's Schooling with Routledge Press. And she has a current book project, CompuGirls Becoming. Professor Scott was named in 2014 as a White House Champion of Change for STEM access. That same year, Diverse Issues in Higher Education identified her as one of the top 30 women in higher education. Her talk today is entitled Sharecropping, Intersectionality, Why Disparity Persists for Women of Color in Technology Fields. So feel free, as always, to ask questions in the question box or in the chat. Professor Scott will address them after her talk. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Professor Scott to George Mason University and to the Shar School. So, Professor Scott.
Thank you so much, Dean Roselle. I really appreciate that very gracious and kind introduction. I will begin to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see. Yes? Since this is sort of a webinar, it's hard to say yes or no, or yes, to tell if that's accurate. I was saying in preparation for this talk that one of the things that we've all found is that Zoom is very fatiguing, and particularly webinars. It's very, very challenging to be engaging. So I'm going to try to make this more of a dialogue rather than just me speaking into the void. So what I'd like to begin first and foremost is if you could put into the chat where you're from, meaning what school, what department, that would be super, super helpful. What I would like to do is also ask questions and not wait till the end, but encourage people to stop me and to indicate if there's something that they want greater clarification on, or for me to explicate a point. Okay, so let's begin. So what I'd like to do for today is give a little bit of history about myself, because I do think that it's incredibly important for us to understand where we've been and how it influences where we are now, certainly where we're going. So I'm going to mingle my own history with the history of CompuGirls, as Dean Roselle talked about, and then lead to how it influenced the formation of the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology, often known as CGEST. Oh, good, I see people putting things into the chat. Continue, please. And then I want to talk about how I see intersectionality and it's linked to sharecropping, which is both of those frameworks are influencing my current book, my current project and my current book, which is going to be an Oxford University Press publication due out 2022, 2023. The Compy Girls book, which I'll talk a little bit more about, that should be out this year in fall, actually. And then I want to talk a little bit about moving forward, like what am I doing at the end, or what am I doing going forward? So hopefully that makes sense, and let's begin. There we go. So I'm one of those people that I like to see what was going on at a time and how does it influence policy, how does it influence actions, and particularly systems. I know that the Center for Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy is invested in this type of endeavor. And what I saw in the beginning of the 2000s, and this was at a time that I was a junior professor at a school in New York, Hofstra University to be exact, is that this was a time when we saw an incredible increase of technology. iPods, if we remember iPods, they were released. Phones, my gosh, phones began to have cameras at this time. That was in 2003. Google Maps that launched in 2005. USB flash drives became more ubiquitous. Does anyone remember the floppy disks? I do. I distinctly remember those floppy disks, but we started to have USB drives take the place of floppy disks. And for those of us who are gamers, I'm not, but my teenage daughter is, game consoles became more like entertainment units. And PlayStation, it had the capacity for DVDs and game discs. MySpace 2003 and Facebook 2004. So we started to see in the early 2000s a lot of things going on, and I encourage you to put in the chat other things that I have forgotten that was going on in the 2000s. But one thing that was really consistent with this development of technology was who was at the center. And my critical theory critique is that at the center of all of these developments remained an iconic image, and that is of a white male creator or white male hacker or white male entrepreneur. And so I've said in earlier pieces, this idea that technology is not culturally relevant, I don't think it's true. It's always been culturally relevant for white male heteronormative icons. And so what was going on with girls of color? There's this belief that in the early 2000s, girls of color, particularly African American, Native American, Latina, Pacific Islanders, Alaskan Natives were invisible in this digital age. Well, okay, to some extent, yes, we were invisible, particularly if we look at Mia Aung's work, that you don't really see a strong presence of research about and with girls and women of color until about 2008. But our invisibility does not and should not be equated to inactivity. Indeed, we see in out of school context, for instance, AAAS, as some of you may remember, in 1975, there was the AAAS sponsored conference and then the report, specifically and intentionally looking at why women of color are underrepresented or were underrepresented in STEM. We also see a really interesting bit of movement in out of school networks, and I'll get to that momentarily. But I was in this early part of the 2000s looking at the tenor of the times, but also having been incredibly influenced by my training at Rutgers University, where I earned my doctorate of education. It was there, as I was a graduate student, and so many of us, I was a teaching assistant. And that gave me the opportunity to interact with pre-service teachers, some phenomenal young people who were really invested in terms of saying, I want to make a difference. I want to work in what at that time was considered special needs districts. In fact, I had been a fourth grade teacher in what was called a special needs district, which is in my mind just code for a district that was disproportionately African American and coming from low income backgrounds. And so during this time as a graduate student and certainly as a teaching assistant, I was incredibly influenced by Geneva Gay's work, Gloria Ladson-Billings, on culturally responsive and culturally relevant pedagogies. And the influence was absolutely, we should expect that kids who are in these special needs districts, so to speak, they don't need to simply and cannot simply meet expectations. They can exceed expectations if provided sustained opportunities and resources to do so. So one of my big theories in use was that teachers' role is not merely to help kids fit into an unfair system, but rather to give them the skills, the knowledge, and the dispositions to change the inequities. And this comes from Gloria Ladson-Billings. But for those of us who are in education, and shout out if you were representing the College of Education, I'd love to see that in the chat. We know that so many pre-service teachers, and I learned that later on when I became a professor teaching courses in administration, that so many of them were fearful. They knew that their jobs were assessed based on how their students did on standardized tests. So then the pre-service teachers and my administrating, or teachers who wanted to be administrators, countless times they told me, yeah, culturally relevant and culturally responsiveness sounds great in theory, but how is it going to make me and help me keep my job? Since I'm going to be judged on students' performance. And no matter what my answer was, I observed so many well-meaning pre-service teachers and administrators opt for employment in well-resourced schools or apply their skills in out-of-school programs. The perceived ineffectiveness of a well-known framework, such as culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy, was outweighed by the supposed deficits of students navigating low-income urban schools. And this malaise moved me. And so when I became a junior professor at Hofstra, taking into account all of this experience of what I heard and what I was continuing to hear, I thought, how can we bridge this gap between theory and practice? And what I saw is that there were some interesting possibilities in out of school or after school programming. So again, in the early 2000s, we saw programs that were taking into account that technology booms that I talked about earlier, programs such as Sisters for Science, YWCA, Kids in Tech, TechBridge, Girls Creating Games, Cafe Universo. We saw programs that were saying, number one, we need to really look at our girl children first. And we learned this later with the Girl Effect program, that if we want to make change, and I know the GAP Center understands this, that if we want to make change, we need to start with girls because we're going to get more return on our investments. There's going to be a bigger impact starting with girls in terms of impact on society, economics, education. So we see that these after school programs says, let's start with girls. But we also see these organizations and others saying, not only should we start with girls, but we need to start with girls and ensure that they are increasing their interest and motivation in this technology systems. So, why? At the same time, these out-of-school experiences were looking at the data. These program developers were seeing what I'm showing here, and there's conflicts, right? So we see in the first bar graph that African-American female college freshmen with an interest in computer science, there was a decrease from 2004 to 2008. We also see the inverse for Native American women. 405 Native American women were declaring interest in 2004, but then it increased. And then for Hispanic females, there was a decrease, but not as large of a decrease percentage-wise as for African American. Why? What is going on? And I think that not only for then, but also for now, we tend to explain these waves, these patterns by various ways. One, we tend to say socially or culturally, these communities or individuals coming from these communities, they tend to lack role models. They tend to have families that are technophobic, using Anna Everett's term, as well as Barbara Monroe's, that they tend to not come from communities that are steeped and interested in technology. And therefore, these outcomes make sense. And then there's another argument. There's the argument of saying, okay, well, one way to explain these data is that individuals from these communities, they are in schools where teachers are not given support, or teachers are actually playing out their biases. Catherine Rigo-Crumb's newest work talks about teacher biases and how it influences girls of color's long-term vision of themselves in computer science. And that teachers also, and schools also, thinking about Jane Margolis's work as well as Joanna Good's, that schools identify certain students according to having talent within or building upon their talent. They have enough potential that we need to build upon their talent. And so I wanted to debunk all of these ideas. And when I was a junior professor, at least challenge them, is I started a program called Teaching, Learning, and Community that ultimately led to CompuGirls. I won't talk too much about teaching, learning, and community. Again, it's in the book that's coming out in the fall. Thankfully, I just submitted my copy edits, so my proofs, so it should be on board to come out in, I think, October or so. But I want to talk a little bit about CompuGirls, because it was born at a time when I wanted to, and I collectively was able to implement culturally responsive and culturally relevant activities with computing, and to really position girls of color as what I call technosocial change agents. So what we do and did in CompuGirls is absolutely, it was a digital equity program. I'm thinking of George Mason University's Paul Gorski, who has written and really influenced my work about digital inclusion. And so it was a digital inclusion program that we really wanted to ensure that girls of color, African American, Native American, and Latinx in particular, at the time, with the first cohort being 2007, we wanted to ensure that they got access to how to build digital stories, how to build in virtual worlds, how to think like a programmer through using and being exposed to coding. But we also wanted them to understand that technology is simply a tool that they can manipulate, a tool that they can use to identify a community issue, describe it, analyze it, and offer solutions to make changes, transformative systemic changes. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And so CompuGirls, I've developed it in concert with others, meaning individuals with Indigenous knowledge, system social psychologists, and certainly computer scientists, human-centered roboticists, biostatisticians. It encouraged, and it's an atmosphere that can range from, sometimes we offer in partnership with community organizations such as YWCA, Boys and Girls Club. It really depends. Girl Scouts, and I'm a big Girl Scouts proponent, having been a Girl Scout leader and a Girl Scout myself. But what we do is we want to have girls to become what I call technosocial change agents, meaning that they bridge the technology abilities with what I call their power skills in order to change the community. We've been able to have programs, it's mainly out of school, but we have been able to partner with some in-school programs. We've been able to offer summer school programs, and we have grown. Right now, we have a cybersecurity Copy Girls program in Hawaii, thanks to a Department of Defense STEM grant. We've been able to also work as far east as New Jersey, which is primarily where I grew up, in New York and New Jersey area. And so you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, Champions of Change. It was once I was recognized for CompuGirls as a White House Champion of Change, that it allowed me to get in a current with other individuals that were doing similar work. Like I really appreciate the work of Dr. Wendy Manuel Scott in her Paul Robeson Saturday Leadership Academy. And I got access to so many others who were doing interesting and important work. And one thing that I noticed is that, save for the roundtables that we were able to participate with at the White House, we were often siloed. And so I expressed interest in terms of creating a hub that is formalized and that would support and develop research, advocacy work, as well as program specific to women of color, girls of color in STEM. And I expressed this and was able to thankfully get support from ASU's president, as well as my dean, to create the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. So the center, our mission is to create this interdisciplinary, racially, ethnically diverse team. And I'm so, so proud to say that the majority of the 30 plus people affiliated with the center, whether staff or graduate students or undergraduates or associate faculty or faculty, we are incredibly diverse. We are one of the most diverse research units at Arizona State University. And our mission is to explore, identify, and ultimately create innovative scholarship, best practices for underanticipated girls. And I can talk about why I prefer the term underanticipated rather than underrepresented. And so we do this through, we have three arms: advocacy, capacity building, and knowledge. Our advocacy is, some examples of our advocacy are the Women of Color STEM Entrepreneurship Conference. We just finished that. And I'll show a slide as that impact. Capacity building are programs where we are building. So CompuGirls is one program within the center. We have a Learning in Libraries program, which is a CompuGirls program, but within libraries, and many others. And then we have the knowledge arm, that's research. Not only researching what we do, but also creating methodologies that can be more culturally responsive and culturally relevant to the capacity building research that we're doing. Everything is interconnected. How can we build programs, I say, without knowing the best ways to build them, which we can come to understand through the knowledge? And how can we ensure that decision makers understand the impact of our research without making it accessible through the advocacy arm? And so this is just a quick example, and I want to take a pause. As I said, we just finished our Women of Color STEM Entrepreneurship Conference, incredibly impactful, even though it was virtual. It was originally supposed to be in Hawaii. I know, very sad, but in partnership with Hawaii Pacific University, we were able to have over 100 people attend the virtual conference that had 17 sessions, and we are continuing that work over the next couple of years in creating a 10-year plan using Systems Map. And I'll be more than happy to talk about that, as well as to invite so many of you who are on this call to participate, because it's going to be through coalitions that we really move the needle for women of color and STEM, since disparity still continues. Let me take a pause here before I talk about what I really want to talk about and get your feedback, which is the newest chapter in the book. So, questions, comments? I see one question. Thank you. Napster was important in radically altering music. You're absolutely correct. And that comes from Jeremy. And yes, Girl Scout, lifetime Girl Scout, Jennifer. We have a lot to talk about then. Absolutely. I'm a big, big, big proponent. Oh yes, floppy disks did hold only one chapter of a book. I know, Jean, that was so sad. Did you like run to the library as I did with your floppy disk?
Yes. Yep. Although I had this old K-Pro computer that hummed like an old Volkswagen. So probably not enough people here old enough to remember those things.
I remember Volkswagens.
Well, Volkswagen, yeah, but not K-Pro computers.
No, gosh, those were the times. How quickly. And then I see someone who says JP Singh, not in education, and yeah, Paulo Freire. I remember that was one of the first books I read, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in my research as well, and how important that was. So thank you for taking us down that. Any questions or comments before I get into the chapter? No? Again, I'm trying to be interactive because I know how hard this is.
I wake up my colleagues here.
Yeah. They're thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had to, really participate. Okay, so what I am really needing is, so this is a new book that I'm working on. As I said, it's Oxford University Press. And what I am hoping to do with this book, and it's really thanks to the support of and this is my team at CJS, we're incredibly diverse. It's really in support of the work that I'm doing as an ARC virtual scholar, is to think about and to implement a systems approach to why disparity persists. What is interesting is right now the book is called Why Disparity Persists in STEM for Women of Color in STEM. It's a little convoluted. I'm still working on it. But what I thought was really interesting is, first of all, there was no book. We had to do a search. There was no book that really had that title. But yet, just what was it last week, we saw these data that were released by Pew. And so we see here is that women of color, in particular, Black women and Hispanic women in STEM, so individuals who've already earned their STEM degrees, have jobs. We still continue to earn far less than white women, Black men, Hispanic men, Asian women, white men, and Asian men. We also know from Joan C. Williams' work that even when women of color are in STEM employment opportunities, African-American women are 76% more likely to be asked to prove their competencies by their colleagues. We also know from Joan C. Williams' work is that Latina women are more likely, over 60% more likely than any other woman, to be asked to perform household duties within their job environments, literally to clean up. And these are women who have already gotten their STEM degrees, already survived the hostile environments that we see being cultivated in most higher education institutions, and gotten the jobs despite not earning as much. The implicit biases, the microaggressions persist. And so I personally say, well, let's think about these transgressions through an intersectional lens. Now, many of us have heard about intersectionality. I'd love to see in the chat what you know about intersectionality or what you've heard about intersectionality. Take a moment, put it in the chat, what you've heard, what you know about intersectionality. I know, this is interactive. And the reason I'm asking us to do this is I think so many of us, we've heard about intersectionality. We know intersectionality is a framework that's looking at the multitude of oppressions and how it differentially affects particularly African-American women. We certainly know Kimberly Crenshaw's amazing work, where she very clearly in her 1989 piece, and oftentimes Crenshaw is termed as coining the phrase intersectionality, even though it has a very long history going back to Sojourner Truth and Anna Julia Cooper's work. But we know that it's about looking at the combined effects of practices which discriminate on the basis of race and on the basis of sex. However, I want to extend, and I've been extending this idea of intersectionality, looking really particularly at Patricia Hill Collins' newest work, her 2019 book, Intersectionality is Critical Social Theory. Because it's in this book, she artfully talks about the architecture of intersectionality as having some particular core constructs. Those core constructs being social context, relationality, power, social inequality, complexity, and social justice. I won't spend time in going over all of them because it would take too much time to do so. But for the purposes of my new project, and in particular thinking about sharecropping, and I'll get to that momentarily, and how it influences STEM education, particularly for women of color, I pay a lot of attention to social context, power, and social justice. So for me, social context in the intersectionality framework, it refers to our understanding the social context of knowledge production and generation. That knowledge production and generation are super important because it helps us to identify and highlight the particular perspectives, her stories, politics, and communities that influence individuals and group identities. The social context then is much more than the physical locale in which individuals find themselves. It then concerns how the individual interprets the context and how the context gives meaning to the intersecting identity markers of the individual. So one of the questions that I am pursuing in this new book of trying to answer the question why disparity continues is what types of social contexts are created by, drum roll, the system of funding. I'll get to why I'm perversely interested in that. Power. Power in the intersectional framework operates across and through multiple domains. It includes, as Collins and Bilge played out in their 2016 work, power includes the interpersonal, disciplinary, cultural, and structural domains, right? Power also involves recognizing one's circumstances and activating one's skills to critically assess situations and cause change, going back to my belief and use of the term technosocial change agents. Power is about relationships. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about that. Power concerns identifying, as I said earlier, community assets, using the communication styles that will cause the most impactful and sustained change. Power involves girls of color assuming both technical, coding, for instance, skills, and the social behavior so that they can become the technosocial change agents that CompuGirls and my other programs are attempting to foster. Power, there's a reciprocity to it. So then this leads to the second question. Shaping this particular book, how do structural domains of power operate to maintain disparity? And then third, social justice. Social justice in the intersectional frame, or at least my understanding of it, is a tool that can be used to effectively confront and transform inequity. Notice I'm not using the term reform, but transform inequity. And I'm not using the term reform because in Intersectionality is critical social theory, Collins talks about how we need to understand the nuances between transformation and reformation. And I agree. Transformation should be about changing and creating something new, and reformation oftentimes, whether it's about the research that we do or the programs that we build, it's usually about adding on. There's an additive approach to reformation rather than transformation. So for me, social justice is about how we are helping students learn how to deconstruct inequitable text systems and develop new ones. It's about recognizing the needs to engage in this type of work by accessing and valuing girls and women of color's cultural systems and building on it so that they can create something new. So for me, I'm really interested in how funders are supporting efforts that are transformative rather than reformative. And I am pursuing answers to these questions by thinking about sharecropping. Now we know sharecropping. And again, this is where the interactivity comes. I'd love to see in the chat your knowledge of sharecropping. I'm looking particularly at sharecropping through the W.E.B. Du Bois 1935 Black Reconstruction in America. I'm thinking in particular about how sharecropping has specific aspects, meaning this, it has a semblance of desirability, that there is, but in actuality, there's complete control by the landowners in contract structuring. I'm thinking about generational debt or debt peonage. I'm thinking about the constraints of emancipation, even though it seems like individuals, meaning the sharecroppers, and I myself am a product, our family had sharecroppers, like many of us. And I'm also thinking about the differential effects of sharecropping. And so I'm using this idea of sharecropping to make sense of what we are finding using a computational topic modeling approach. So intersectionality then is influencing our methodology. It's influencing how I ultimately hope to make a paradigmatic shift on exploring how funders and their patterns of looking at women of color and girls of color in STEM manifested through their solicitations, and in some cases through who they're actually funding. And as I said, I'm doing this through computational topic modeling. What fun. I really hope that there are people on here who do computational topic modeling. If you are, please write into the chat. I have the opportunity to work with data scientists. As I said, I'm really a proponent for interdisciplinarity. So I work with a data scientist. I also work with a sociologist a sociologist of philosophy who also does work in biology. And we get to look at computational topic modeling. And so I understand computational topic modeling as a way to answer those three questions. It's a way to decompose documents. For our purposes, we're looking at gray literature, meaning solicitations. And we are looking at how clusters of co-occurring words form topics. It helps us see past traditional categories. With the topic model, I understand that we are accounting for every word in some combination of topics. So then each solicitation for us is a document, are known as what we're calling as a bag of words. And the order of words is not really important, at least not initially. And what we've done is both colloquia and concordance analyses. A colloquia analysis, according to my understanding, is it provides meaningful changes as to what terms appear and where over time. And it does this by giving relative or raw frequencies or occurrences. So colloquia uses a confidence interval. We're using p-values, and we use a statistical significance of words appearing together within a collocational window. So we're looking at 5 words before and 5 words after certain topics. And then for for fun, concordances are simply allowing us to look at how those words are being associated. I can talk more specifically about the technical aspects if you're interested. So what are we doing? We looked at every single NSF RFP we could get our hands on. And so that meant that we could only search and identify over 2,000, over 2,400 files. In fact, we identified actually 5,300 NSF files or solicitations from 1989 onwards. Prior to 1989, we couldn't find anything. It kind of makes sense because the web really didn't become exciting and popular to the 1990s, and so NSF was cutting edge. We could also only identify 2,400 of those 5,300 solicitations because we had to literally get the solicitation. And so what we did was we looked at certain frequencies and occurrences. And again, this is just a very, very quick presentation of the topic analysis. And these were some of my surprises. So what all this means, because I really do want to spend time, and I know we're running out of it, I want to spend time in dialogue, is we saw a couple of trends from NSF. We did also NIH, and we're doing foundations, both nonprofit as well as corporate foundations, but let me just talk about NSF. So what we see is that there was a swell of the term women, but not so much women of color until like 2017. We also see, according to Intersectionality, it appears less than a dozen times. So there was no statistical significance, so we really couldn't do anything. The terms broadening participation, increasing participation, advancement are all related to underrepresentation. And there were various variations of this. So intersectionality completely was not recognized. Underrepresentation has this really funky intersection with certain terms like women and minorities. But what we did see, and I wanted to see what were the top topics in NSF between 89. And if you look at the bottom table, those were the top topics. Well, me being who I am, I wanted to drill down further. And I wanted to see if we could see in these top topics how certain constructs of intersectionality and women of color appear. Again, I'm just looking at solicitations for NSF. And we see that women, not women of color, it had an interesting pattern where it goes up, down, meaning there were a lot of solicitations and the term women went up, down, and in fact, we see in 2018 that it's up, down is not at the same rate as the term inclusion. Now, we're continuing to do analyses, and I can talk about some of my surprises. For instance, the word Negro became really popular in about 2008, 2010, until about 2012. We also did not find anything that had the word Latina. That may make sense because NSF and like NIH has to go for OMB terms, so that could make sense. We also see, and this was just generated in preparation for today's talk, is that women, the term and the phrase women, very much linked to persons or participation, underrepresented, and minorities, but not of color. Black women, nope. African-American women, nope, don't find statistical significance, or any other racial category. So there's a lot of missing data in NSF. There's a lot of missing data in NIH. What does this all mean in terms of the context? What does this all mean about in terms of disorganization? And most importantly, what this means for my project. And then I'm going to cease. What I see is that couple of things, is that with this very, very brief overview, is that in answer to the first question of what's the social context, is that oftentimes, at least according to our topic modeling, is the deficit model persist. And that this is an act of, in my mind, epistemic violence, thinking about Chrissy Dotson's work, meaning that there's testimonial muteness of trying to at least through funding solicitations and trying to support girls and women of color, or research about girls, women of color being anything more than minorities. There seems to be greater emphasis on getting girls and women of color to participate. And this seems to be desirable, going back to one of the aspects of sharecropping, when in essence, it seems to be reinforcing an interpretive community using intersectional language about simply constraining our and our daughter's potential. The second question about funding opportunities being transformational versus reformative, we don't see that. We see more constraining of agencies, of individuals, and creating constructs, meaning funding that is not encouraging transformation. We didn't see any evidence, such as what Edgar Villanueva puts into his book about decolonizing wealth. We don't see any evidence in which diversity is linked to change. The word change doesn't come up, whether it's about encouraging students, women of color, girls of color, to change their environments, or encouraging researchers to change what they're doing. And then thirdly, we don't really see anything in the data about social justice. I find this incredibly disturbing, especially because solicitations are man-made. So in closing, my newest project is really about transformation. This newest project in and of itself is an intersectional project, meaning it's a resistant knowledge project that counters the testimonial authority of funding agencies and challenging a system that's claiming to be equitable for all. And I think particularly now when our world is enduring what I see is multiple pandemics, structural racism, COVID-19, particularly now we need more centers, more interdisciplinary, more research about women of color and how we are affected by the phenomenon across time, across place, but most importantly, across systems that unfortunately seem to be reinforcing and promoting more of a sharecropper approach to our emancipation than not. So I'll end there and stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Professor Scott. And I noticed there's a number of comments in the chat function. You may want to look through those, and then anyone who wants to raise a question, please do so. Again, trying to make this interactive as you requested.
Great. So I'm going to go bottom up. And I saw JP saying, are your data then showing intersectionality, or that we are far more comfortable speaking of women? Yes, rather than women of color. Yeah, yes, I talk about the lexical numbness based on my computational topic modeling. We're more comfortable, or at least according to my data, we're, sorry, my dog is agreeing with me. We're more comfortable talking about women than we are talking about anything else. I'm sorry, hold on for a second. I'm gonna close the door. Oh, the fun of Zoom. Yes, yeah, we are. We're not seeing anything about intersectionality, or what I even did was say, okay, we're not going to perhaps see the word intersectionality, which we didn't, and we are not using in vivo. We're using this really other funky thing, and one of the things I failed to mention is I am going to do interviews with foundations, senior level people, CEOs, once I have more complete set of data. But I said, let's look at some of the concepts and let's look at some of the synonyms from intersectionality and see if I could find anything else. Nope. I looked at the words context, for instance, crazy mean. Nope. I looked at words change, for instance. Nope. Again, we're using p-values, so there has to be some statistical significance. So this isn't suggesting that those words don't appear, but they don't appear in any way that is really requiring those of us who are seeking funding to pay attention to. Christopher Burke asks for the disparities in preferences, that is, differences among young people and their expressed excitement and interest in technology. CompuGirls, from what I understand, is desire to address this issue. Okay, I'm going to take that one first. What we see is that, at least what I've seen, is that we make this false assumption about girls of color in particular, is that we are not very interested in technology. Well, the data completely have an oppositional story about this. And I'm not talking about my computational topic modeling data, but in general. So girls of color in many interests are more interested and motivated to go into computer science. But it's a long time that so many things happen that dissuades us from being interested. One of the things that I learned is, for instance, we used to bring in, we still do, we bring in industry mentors to speak with the girls. And we do this not only in CompuGirls, but our other programs. And in the beginning, meaning the early 2000s, we made the mistake of not preparing the industry mentors. And these were women of color who were in STEM fields. We wouldn't prepare them. And so they would come and talk with the girls and scare the living bejesus out of them. They would tell these horror stories about how awful it was to be in STEM and not talk about their own assets, not talk about how they changed the hostile environments. And so what we've started to do is put a lot of emphasis on culturally responsive programs, not just for girls, but also for the other individuals, the social actors in their ecosystem, such as industry mentors, such as parents. One of our programs, CompuPower, we have programs for parents, we have programs for industry mentors, so that they can be culturally responsive themselves. And so hopefully that answers your question. Okay, the other part is that different rates of young folks of color switch, out of STEM majors in college. The funding structures you mentioned clearly matter for both, but I wonder which of these two do you think is more salient today? And has it changed over time? If I understand your question, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. So if you could explain a little more, that would be fantastic. Bonnie, I like how you put it. The paradigms forged in the history of oppressions are unlikely to contribute sufficiently to overcoming their damaging legacy. Yes, I agree. And, as I'm doing this analysis, I'm going down the rabbit hole of funding, probably more deeply than I need to, but I know that the Center on Nonprofit Philanthropy and Social Enterprise, you do this work, right? We're seeing more prevalence of big bet funding. And so funding that is for 10 years. And the hope is that that's going to be more transformative. And that's going to start to nurture a legacy with $10 or $20 million, bits of funding. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this. And it'll be more interesting to see who is funded. What I'm seeing in our initial analyses of data for foundations is that it's first of all, it's incredibly opaque. It's almost impossible to get solicitations of funding requests from foundations. I wonder why. Has a lot to do with what I would say interpersonal domains of power. And so that's one of the things that I'll be talking about, or I'm talking about in my book. But then what I do see is once the foundation funds an organization, they fund them over and over and over again. I literally do not see how that foundation is assessing why they should be funded over and over and over again. We do see, of course, more presence of consulting firms that are working with foundations for these big bets. So it's not necessarily the foundations, for instance, that are saying, okay, this is what the RFP should look like, but consulting agencies that are creating the RFPs. So this means for me, perhaps I'm looking in the wrong area. Maybe I should be looking at those consultant agencies, which are even more opaque than the foundations. And I love foundations. I've got money from foundations, don't get me wrong. But I think that this is an opportunity. I really do think, and in my upcoming work, I think this is an opportunity for us to get more people at the table, to not simply dialogue, but to collectively set the table. Oh, Bonnie, I want to hear more about your book. Oh, thank you, Christopher. So Christopher writes, nurturing the preferences of young people often requires a different set of interventions than dealing with issues of attrition, okay, and discouragement among those that have already expressed interest. I get it. I simply wanted your thoughts on which place of emphasis matters more for addressing racial disparities. I get it. That's a really good question. And I was going to say in my talk, there seems to be two approaches. One, to not only funding, but two approaches for also reform work. Notice not transformative work, but reform work. One approach is to say, let's steal students and girls of color in armor so that they can survive the pipeline. And I personally hate the term pipeline. We can talk about that if you want. But let's steal them. And in my Concrete Girls book, I call it the astronaut approach. Let's, don girls of color with a suit of armor so that they can survive in an area that they weren't meant to survive, more or less thrive. And the other approach is let's change the pipeline. Let's change those experiences so that they won't be discouraged. That tends to be what we look at. And what I'm arguing, and thank you so much for rewording the question, is let's take a step back and more systematically look at the systems, such as funding, that have created these two approaches, whether we're stealing the individual or we are changing the pipeline. So my Concrete Girls work, yes, it's evolved to this point where I'm saying, let's take a systems approach first and foremost. And I'm ultimately going to argue, hey, funders, you need to really put some money into systemic, rigorous research. And I know we only have less than 60 seconds left. And I would also add to that culture responsive collaboration to do that research. And then, yes, Dean.
Oh, yeah, we're getting close, but Jennifer Victor, I think, has one more in the chat, which I think is very germane to your talk. Maybe we can close on that one.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. And so Jennifer asked, can you speak to strategies for targeting training for adults, specifically in academia, where the population of, say, PhD students is already imbalanced towards white men? How can we develop strategies that bring training and specialized methodologies? Yes, the racial and gender disparities in society for political methodology have been difficult to affect. It's a good question, and I don't have a really quick or good answer. I think that I do think that we need to be incredibly mindful, especially in a time where higher education is rushing to do something. And I'm thinking of Dismantling Racism workbook, that a lot of time organizations implement white supremacist ideas through urgency rather than thinking about process. And so I think that that higher education, like any system, needs to be spending some time on processes to identify the strategies rather than simply saying we urgently need to address this and just throwing people in and throwing in strategies that have not been found to be supportive, more or less transformative.
Great. All right. Well, that brings us right to 1 o'clock. Perfect. So Dr. Kimberly Scott, Really appreciate your presentation today, that you were willing to take some time from your busy schedule and Zoom overload to be with us today in this virtual environment. But you have a connection to George Mason University. You come to DC occasionally, I understand. So let's plan on doing something together on campus when we're all back in person. I think that would be really delightful if we could all meet each other there.
Would love that.
All right, very good. Thank everybody for attending, and we'll see you at the next forum. And again, Kim, thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all. Stay safe.
All right, take care, everybody.